My name is Chloe, and I am 30 years old. 10 years ago, when I was just a 20-year-old college student, I experienced a betrayal so profound and violating that it completely redefined my understanding of family. My own parents, the people who were supposed to protect me and guide me into adulthood, secretly forged my signature, drained my entire college trust fund, and physically threw me out into the street when I confronted them. They discarded me like a piece of trash to fund the lavish lifestyle of my older sister, convinced that I was a worthless, uneducated burden who would never amount to anything. They assumed they had successfully buried my future to build her pedestal. But they made a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar miscalculation. Because 10 years later, those same parents, drowning in debt and facing absolute bankruptcy, desperately pitched their sinking company to a massive private equity firm for a bailout. They had absolutely no idea that the anonymous, ruthless billionaire CEO evaluating their desperate plea was the exact daughter they had thrown to the wolves. They thought they were securing their salvation. They didn't know I was simply taking their exact measurements for a financial guillotine. To understand the depth of their crime, you have to understand the toxic ecosystem of my childhood. I grew up in a wealthy, status-obsessed household in the upscale suburbs of Connecticut. My father, Richard, was a mid-level corporate executive who operated on ego and appearances. My mother, Evelyn, was a professional socialite whose entire self-worth was tied to her standing in the local country club. And then there was my older sister, Harper. Harper was the undeniable, untouchable golden child. She was 3 years older than me, effortlessly charming, and a master manipulator. My parents worshipped her. They paid for her European vacations, her designer wardrobe, and her elite private schooling. I, on the other hand, was the family's afterthought. I was quiet, deeply analytical, and entirely uninterested in their superficial pageantry. My parents treated my existence like a frustrating administrative error. While Harper was handed brand new luxury cars, I was expected to pay for my own bus pass. The only person who truly saw me was my late grandmother, my father's mother. When she passed away during my freshman year of college, my parents were furious to discover that she hadn't left her liquid estate to Richard. Instead, recognizing the cruel dynamic in our home, she had established a private trust fund exclusively in my name, containing exactly $100,000 for my college tuition and future endeavors. It was locked until my 20th birthday. For 2 years, I worked part-time jobs just to pay for my dorm and basic necessities, patiently waiting for the day I could access the funds and finally breathe. My 20th birthday arrived on a quiet Tuesday. I didn't get a phone call from my parents or a card from Harper. I didn't care. I walked into the local branch of the bank, handed the manager my ID, and asked to formally assume control of the trust account. The bank manager tapped at his keyboard, frowned, and then clicked his mouse a few more times. He looked up at me, his expression shifting into a polite, uncomfortable confusion. "I'm sorry, miss," he said gently. "This account was closed and the funds were fully withdrawn 3 months ago." The air was violently sucked out of my lungs. "That's impossible," I stammered, my hands gripping the edge of his desk. "The funds were frozen until today. I am the sole beneficiary." He turned his monitor toward me. "The funds were released early under a hardship provision, authorized by a notarized signature from you, transferring the balance directly into a joint account held by Richard and Evelyn." I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. The signature on the digital scan looked like mine, but the loop of the C was slightly off. My mother was an expert at forging my handwriting on school permission slips when I was a kid. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Over the past 3 months, Harper had launched a ridiculous, high-end, luxury concierge startup company, and my parents had thrown her a staggering $50,000 wedding at a vineyard. I had wondered how they afforded it after my father complained about bonuses being slashed at his firm. They hadn't afforded it, they had stolen it. My parents had forged my signature, committed massive bank fraud, and drained my entire inheritance to fund the golden child's vanity projects. I didn't call the police right away. In a foolish, lingering flicker of childhood conditioning, I drove directly to my parents' sprawling suburban estate, clutching the printed bank statements in my shaking hands. I needed to look them in the eye. I needed them to tell me it was a mistake. I found Richard and Evelyn in the kitchen. My mother was sipping white wine, and my father was reviewing a golf catalog. "You stole it," I said, my voice trembling but loud enough to shatter the quiet domestic scene. I threw the bank statements onto the granite kitchen island. "You forged my signature, and you drained my grandmother's trust." My mother set her wine glass down, her face immediately hardening into a mask of furious, defensive indignation. My father didn't even look at the papers. He just glared at me. "Lower your voice in my house, Chloe," Richard snapped, stepping forward. "Where is my money?" I demanded, the shock morphing into a white-hot, blinding rage. That was my tuition. That was my future. "Oh, grow up," Evelyn sneered, rolling her eyes. "You didn't need $100,000 for that mediocre state school. Harper was launching a vital business. She needed seed capital to secure her future. We are a family, Chloe. We share our resources for the greater good." "You committed a felony." I screamed, the absolute insanity of their justification pushing me over the edge. "You stole from me to pay for her ridiculous wedding and a fake company. I'm calling the police." The moment I said the word police, the dynamic shifted from toxic dismissal to physical violence. My father's face turned purple. He lunged across the kitchen, grabbing me roughly by the upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into my bicep. "You selfish, ungrateful little brat," he spat, dragging me toward the front hallway. "We put a roof over your head for 18 years. That money was ours by right. You will not threaten this family." "Let go of me." I thrashed, but he was too strong. He hauled me to the front door, yanked it open, and literally threw me out onto the front porch. I stumbled and fell hard onto the concrete, scraping my knees. Evelyn stood in the doorway, looking down at me with absolute, chilling disgust. "Do not ever come back here. You are completely unstable." The door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked. I was 20 years old, sitting on the pavement with a bruised arm, no money, and no family. I went to the police the next day, but the battle was rigged from the start. Richard had used a notary who was a close friend from his country club to verify the forged signature. My parents hired a high-priced defense attorney who immediately launched a vicious, calculated smear campaign. They told the extended family, the authorities, and anyone who would listen that I was a troubled, emotionally unstable drug addict who had willingly given them the money and was now having a psychotic break to extort them. Faced with the word of a respected corporate executive versus a broke college student, the investigation stalled. The legal fees required to fight them in civil court were money I simply didn't have. I lost. They won. But as I sat in a freezing, tiny studio apartment I rented with the last of my savings, shivering under a cheap blanket, the tears finally stopped. I realized that my parents hadn't just stolen my money, they had given me the greatest gift of my life. They had completely severed the chains of my obligation to them. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was a ghost, and ghosts are incredibly dangerous. The next 10 years of my life were a masterclass in relentless, agonizing endurance. I refused to let their theft be the end of my story. I took a grueling night shift as a waitress at a 24-hour diner, smelling of grease and exhaustion just to keep a roof over my head. During the day, I finished my finance degree online, operating on 3 hours of sleep and an absolute, unyielding diet of spite. When I graduated at 22, I packed my meager belongings and moved to New York City. I landed an entry-level analyst position at a mid-tier investment bank. I didn't socialize. I didn't date. I became a machine. My dyslexia of the heart, my inability to process love from my family, translated perfectly into the cold, calculated world of high finance. I could read a failing balance sheet like a surgeon looking at an X-ray. I knew exactly where to cut, where to bleed, and where to invest. By the time I was 26, my aggressive strategies had made my firm millions. I took my bonuses, leveraged my elite network, and broke away to found my own private equity firm, Apex Capital *. My primary operational rule at Apex was total, absolute anonymity. I knew that my family, despite blocking my number and pretending I was dead, would inevitably try to leech off my success if they ever saw my name in Forbes or the Wall Street Journal. I appointed a brilliant, fiercely loyal man named David as my public-facing CFO. He was the voice, the signature, and the face of the company. I remained entirely in the shadows, the anonymous majority shareholder and CEO pulling every string from a secure, glass-walled office overlooking Manhattan. Over the next 4 years, Apex Capital became a titan. We acquired failing luxury brands, stripped them of their toxic management, and rebuilt them. I was a 30-year-old billionaire, wrapped in custom couture, operating as an absolute ghost. I never checked my family's social media. I didn't care. I assumed they were living their perfect country club lives, laughing about the daughter they had discarded. I assumed wrong. Karma is not a mystical force. It is simply the inevitable mathematical consequence of profound incompetence. 10 years after they stole my inheritance, Harper's luxury concierge business was a catastrophic, smoldering ruin. It turns out that being a manipulative golden child does not actually translate into business acumen. She had burned through my $100,000 in 6 months, and instead of letting the business fail, Richard and Evelyn had desperately tried to prop her up to save face in their elite social circles. I learned all of this on a rainy Tuesday morning when David walked into my office and placed a thick, red-tabbed dossier on my desk. "We just received a highly aggressive pitch for a massive corporate buyout," David said, a strange, tight smile playing on his lips. "It's a luxury lifestyle brand based out of Connecticut. They are begging Apex Capital for a $4 million cash injection. I think you're going to want to look at the ownership structure." I opened the file. Staring back at me were the financial disclosures for Harper Luxe Inc. I felt a cold, electric shock travel down my spine. I flipped through the pages. The business was functionally bankrupt. They were bleeding cash, drowning in vendor lawsuits, and completely out of leverage. But the true horror, the absolute, jaw-dropping karma, was in the collateral section. Richard and Evelyn had secretly taken out multiple, massive secondary mortgages on their pristine suburban estate to keep Harper's business afloat. They had leveraged their entire retirement, their home, and their reputation. They were nearly $5 million in debt to a regional bank. If they didn't secure a buyout immediately, the bank was going to foreclose on their estate and liquidate Harper's assets. They would be left homeless and humiliated. "They reached out to our acquisitions team completely blind," David confirmed. "They have no idea who owns Apex Capital. They just know we have a reputation for saving distressed luxury brands. Richard has been calling our intermediaries every day, begging for a meeting with the CEO. He says they are preparing a massive relaunch gala this weekend to showcase the brand's value to us." I sat in my leather chair, staring at the desperate, pathetic numbers on the page. They had stolen my future to build this ship, and now they were begging me for a life raft. "Do we reject the pitch?" David asked gently. I looked up, a dark, merciless smile slowly spreading across my face. "No, David," I whispered. "We don't reject it, we buy the bank." I didn't actually buy the whole bank. But with the kind of liquid capital I possessed, purchasing high-risk distressed debt from a regional lender was child's play. My legal team moved with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours, Apex Capital had quietly, legally purchased the entirety of Richard and Evelyn's $5 million mortgage debt, as well as the commercial liens against Harper's business. I didn't just hold the keys to their bailout. I was officially their sole creditor. I owned the ground they walked on. Saturday night arrived. Harper, operating under the delusional assumption that a flashy party would convince Apex Capital to hand her millions, had organized a lavish relaunch gala in the grand ballroom of their country club. According to the guest list we acquired, she had invited 200 of the wealthiest socialites, investors, and family friends in Connecticut. I sat in the back of a blacked-out Maybach, idling just outside the country club entrance. I wore a striking, blood-red Alexander McQueen gown that fit like liquid armor. My hair was swept back into a severe, elegant chignon, and a diamond necklace rested against my collarbone. I looked exactly like the apex predator they had forged me into. "Are you ready, Miss Sterling?" David asked, sitting beside me, adjusting his suit jacket. Flanking us in the SUV behind were three of the most terrifying corporate litigators in New York. "Let's go crash a wedding," I replied. We bypassed the valet and walked directly into the glittering ballroom. The room was a sea of champagne and desperate pageantry. Richard was standing near the grand stage, holding court with a group of local executives, sweating profusely but smiling. Harper was twirling in a designer gown she absolutely could not afford, playing the role of the triumphant CEO. At 9:00 p.m., Richard took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard boomed, his voice echoing over the speakers. "Thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate the incredible rebirth of Harper Lux. My brilliant daughter has built an empire. And tonight, we are honored to announce that the CEO of Apex Capital is here to finalize a monumental partnership that will propel this family's legacy into the stratosphere." The crowd erupted into polite, wealthy applause. Richard beamed, looking out over the room, waiting for the mysterious savior to step forward. I stepped out of the shadows and walked straight down the center aisle. The applause died a slow, confused death as I approached the stage. The country club elites didn't recognize me, but as I stepped into the light of the chandeliers, my parents certainly did. Richard's confident smile slid off his face like wet clay. He gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles turning stark white. Evelyn, sitting at the front table, let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Harper froze, her champagne flute trembling. "Chloe," Richard stammered, his voice carrying over the mic, utterly shattering his professional facade. What are you doing here? Security, get her out of here." "Security works for the country club, Richard," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, icy calm. I didn't shout. I walked right up the stairs and onto the stage. "And since I am the CEO of Apex Capital I believe I was invited." The absolute, paralyzing shock that hit my family was a physical force. Richard stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the podium. You are Apex." "I am," I smiled coldly, taking the microphone from his shaking hand. I turned to the 200 guests who were watching the drama unfold with morbid fascination. "Good evening, everyone," I announced. "My father is correct. We are here to discuss the financial reality of the Dixon family legacy. However, Apex Capital is not here to announce a partnership. We are here to execute an audit." I snapped my fingers. David stepped up to the AV booth at the back of the room. The massive projection screen behind Harper's logo violently flickered. Suddenly, the screen was filled with blown-up, high-definition images of Harper's financial ledgers. The red ink was blinding. "For the past 10 years, I projected my voice over the rising tide of panicked whispers, Harper Lux has been operating as a catastrophic failure. They are currently $5 million in debt, entirely sustained by secondary mortgages secretly taken out on Richard and Evelyn's personal estate." "Stop," Evelyn shrieked, jumping out of her chair. "Turn that off, you vindictive, lying little brat, turn it off." "The screens stay on," my lead attorney boomed, stepping onto the stage and dropping a massive binder onto the podium. I clicked a remote in my hand. The screen shifted from the current bankruptcy files to a scanned document from 10 years ago, the forged bank withdrawal slip. "But the true foundation of this company is even darker," I said, looking directly into the horrified faces of their country club friends. 10 years ago, Richard and Evelyn forged my signature, committed massive bank fraud, and drained my $100,000 college trust fund to pay for Harper's wedding and seed this failing company. When I confronted them, they physically threw me out of the house and told you all I was a drug addict. The ballroom erupted into chaos. People were gasping, pulling out cell phones, whispering furiously. Harper looked like she was going to faint. "This is illegal," Richard screamed, tears of absolute panic welling in his eyes. "You can't do this. You have no proof. We will sue you into oblivion." "You can't afford a lawyer, Richard," I whispered, turning off the microphone and stepping into his personal space. "Because you don't have any money left." The air on the stage was thick with the scent of ozone and absolute ruin. Richard was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room as the people he had spent decades trying to impress stared at him with profound, visceral disgust. The myth of the perfect, wealthy family had been incinerated in less than 5 minutes. Harper ran up the stairs, tears streaming down her face, her designer gown dragging on the floor. "Chloe, please, you can't do this. This is my company. I'll lose everything." "Derek will leave me." "Derek should have reviewed your financials before he married you," I replied mercilessly. Richard fell to his knees. The proud, arrogant patriarch literally dropped to the floor in front of me, his hands reaching out to grab the hem of my dress. "Chloe, please," he begged, openly sobbing in front of 200 people. "I'm sorry, I was wrong, we were so wrong. Please, you have to approve the bailout. If you don't give us the capital, the bank is going to foreclose on the house. We'll be homeless. You can't leave your own parents on the street." I looked down at the man who had dragged me by my arm and thrown me onto the concrete. I searched my chest for a single ounce of pity, and I found absolutely nothing. "I didn't come here to bail you out, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet register. I signaled to David, who handed me a thick, notarized legal document. I held it up so Richard could see the official bank seals. "I didn't buy your company," I smiled, a dark, merciless expression. "I bought your debt. Apex Capital purchased the entirety of your mortgages and your commercial liens from the regional bank yesterday morning. I am your sole creditor." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stopped crying and went perfectly, terrifyingly still. "And as your creditor," I announced, turning the microphone back on so the entire room could hear the final sentence, "I am officially denying your restructuring request. I am calling in the debts in full. We are foreclosing on your estate, and we are liquidating Harper Lux effective immediately. You have 30 days to vacate my property." Evelyn let out a blood-curdling shriek and collapsed into a chair. Harper dropped her face into her hands, wailing loudly. "Security," I said smoothly, looking at the guards who were hovering near the stage. "Please escort these 3 individuals out of the venue. They are no longer members of this club, and they can no longer afford the catering." I didn't wait to watch them be dragged out. I handed the microphone to David, turned my back on the weeping, broken remnants of my abusers, and walked out the side door into the cool night air. The fallout was an absolute massacre. When the 30-day eviction notice expired, Richard and Evelyn were forced to pack whatever belongings weren't seized in the liquidation and move into a cramped, depressing 2-bedroom rental on the wrong side of town. The country club revoked their membership, and their wealthy friends abandoned them the exact second the foreclosure became public knowledge. Harper's husband, realizing he had married into a bankrupt, fraudulent family, filed for divorce and sued for primary custody of their children, citing her financial instability. For months, my corporate inbox was flooded with desperate, weeping emails from my mother, begging for forgiveness, pleading for a second chance, and demanding that I remember blood is thicker than water. I didn't read a single one. I created an auto-filter that sent every message containing their names directly to the trash. I had already held their funeral in my heart 10 years ago. I wasn't about to invite their ghosts into my penthouse. Today, Apex Capital is one of the most feared and respected firms on the East Coast. I no longer hide in the shadows. I stepped into the light, gracing the covers of financial magazines not just as a brilliant CEO, but as a woman who built an empire from the ashes of her own betrayal. I surrounded myself with a chosen family, friends, mentors, and peers who value my intellect, respect my boundaries, and never ask me to shrink myself for their comfort. If there is one profound, echoing truth to take away from my journey, it is this: blood does not entitle anyone to your future, and forgiveness does not require giving them access to your life. Society loves to push the narrative that we must always forgive and reconcile with family, no matter how deeply they abuse us. We are told to be the bigger person and endure their exploitation for the sake of peace. But setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you, and you cannot build a kingdom if you keep handing your bricks to the people who are trying to bury you. If toxic people throw you to the wolves, do not weep for the warmth of their fire. Learn to survive the cold, sharpen your teeth, and come back leading the pack. And when they inevitably come begging for the protection of your success, never apologize for letting them drown in the consequences of their own actions. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members who only valued you for what they could extract from you? Or maybe you've been the invisible scapegoat who finally broke free and built your own incredible life. Please drop a comment below and share your story. Reading about your experiences helps remind us all that we aren't alone in these struggles, and I truly love reading what you have to say. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more great videos. Your support helps us keep bringing you empowering, true stories about justice, resilience, and taking back absolute control of your life. You owe toxic people nothing, and you owe yourself everything. Thank you for watching.